is my honor and pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Charles. I like to call him Charlie, but I'll be more formal and call him Charles Cantalupo for now. Charles is a distinguished professor of English, comparative lit, and African studies at Penn State Schuylkill. Penn State has many, many locations, Schuylkill being one of them. He has published numerous works of literary criticism, including War and Peace in Contemporary Eritrean Poetry, and 2 books exploring the work of Ngugi wa Thiong'o. He has published numerous books of translation, including Who Needs a Story, which he co-edited with Ohio University's own Jeremiah Nagash. And he's published an enormous amount of his own creative work, both plays and poems and books of poetry. His most recent book of poetry, Light Delights, came out a year or 2 ago from Red Sea Press. We're here today to celebrate, however, his newest book and memoir, Joining Africa. It has been my honor to know Charlie Cantalupo for 20 years, which is a long time. We met 20 years ago because we both were teaching at Penn State at one of the many satellite campuses that Penn State has, at a university-wide meeting of English faculty. And I asked, as you ask at a meeting like this when you meet a colleague for the first time, so exactly what do you do? And he started talking about Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and I remember my eyes getting very big and thinking, what, where, who? It's a long way from central Pennsylvania to Africa and Asmara. But Charles Cantalupo is here today because he took the trouble to go that long way. This book, which I love, chronicles the courage of Charlie Cantalupo, the emotional courage, first and foremost, because the journey that he'll be telling you about today begins with a singular tragedy in his life, and as many, many wonderful works of literature do, it begins with a search for answers in and around that tragedy. But it also reflects and talks of his immense intellectual courage. It takes a lot of guts, it takes a lot of bravery to plunge yourself into a foreign culture, into languages he does not speak, into a history he does not share, into divisions that he'll never truly understand, and to trust that someday you'll be taken seriously as a scholar, and to trust that someday you'll make a difference, that your work will make a contribution worthy of devoting a career and worthy of the remarkable people, the African poets and artists that he has not just studied, but joined. So, Charlie Cantalupo was a brilliant scholar, but universities such as Penn State and Ohio University are full of brilliant scholars. I'm glad that they are. What sets him apart is his intellectual bravery, his intellectual and emotional courage, the example he has set for future scholars and writers who must make that leap of faith in tackling, immersing themselves in unfamiliar, perhaps even uncomfortable territory. The book that we're going to hear from today and talk about today, Joining Africa, from Anthills to Ansar, tells that story of Charlie Cantalupo plunging himself into a world that was so foreign and trusting that he will be able to understand eventually and make a contribution eventually. And he has made an enormous contribution and continues to make an enormous contribution to bringing these wonderful African artists to our attention. So, a wonderful story, a wonderful book, and a wonderful man. I salute Charlie Cantalupo, and it's time to hear from him.
Thank you so much for being here, and my thanks to my old friend and colleague, Dinty Moore, and the English and Creative Writing program. That's really a touching introduction. I didn't know it was that hard in the process, so and anyone who's interested in pursuing some of the work I do, it's not that hard.
That's what I didn't say, is you could have just gone to the library.
Yeah, yeah.
At the campus where you taught.
Yeah.
So you made it hard for yourself.
Yeah. I mean, now I could just go online and you wouldn't have to even leave my house, the proverbial armchair traveler. Well, maybe not. I also want to thank the African Studies program, the director, Steve Howard, who is here, and the associate director, and my as Dinty said, my colleague in working in a lot of African literature, Gurmai Nagash and Bose Maposa, who is also here, and the collaboration between the two has made this event possible and has made me be able to return to Athens, Ohio. As you might have figured out by now, if only by my accent, although I guess Dinty had a few hints too, I'm really not African. I did, as the title says, I had to join Africa. And in today's reading from the book, I hope to share with you a few signposts on this journey and a little bit of exactly what I mean by joining Africa. So I hope that will come out. I'm going to read 3 excerpts from the book. The first 2 excerpts from rather towards the beginning, and the last excerpt at the very beginning, which really comes chronologically at the end of the story. Is that covers it? Sure. I looked down at my feet in the sandy dirt on a site of ancient Jericho. Ants tunneled where 20 cities had risen and fallen. I couldn't look up, blinded by the pallor of the Dead Sea to the east, and the cliffs and caverns of Qumran to the south, where, according to one account, a Bedouin shepherd, searching for his stray goat 40 years before, had found the Dead Sea Scrolls. To the east, a rickety administration building flying an Israeli flag in tatters between the water and where I stood. And to the north, a seemingly endless abandoned Palestinian refugee camp also forced my eyes to look down at the ants digging around my feet. I could not connect with anything I was seeing or feeling, and I felt as if I didn't exist except as an illusion. 15 years before this moment, during my first year of college, nearly all my preconceptions and values had been undermined by the Vietnam War and the protest movement against it, resulting in soldiers roaming the quads and firing on students. Could you imagine that outside today? It's quite a difference. Campus buildings on fire, universities shut down, the final exams canceled, hallucinogens in and out of everyone's mind, seemingly, and answers to all the problems somehow being far off in Eastern religions and mysticism. Then I read Dante's Commedia. I was enthralled by the terza rima and his vision and all that it resisted and affirmed. I decided at that moment that I had to devote myself to knowing and accounting for my own Western culture before seeking out or learning any other one. Like most first-year students at my university, I really only knew a slice of contemporary American culture. But reading Dante made me want to know more. The early modern literature of England, the painting from the same period of Italy, the Ring of Kerry in Ireland, the monasteries of Mount Athos in Greece, the ruins of Greece, the classical ruins, Ukraine, if I could get there, modern American poetry, London, Paris, and most of all in Rome, I would really find who I was. I decided that the Africa of black nationalists, like the poet Amiri Baraka, who was from my hometown of Newark, New Jersey, and the Asia of beat poets and the Native American ideals and environmentalism, or even American literature before 1900, around when my grandparents on both sides immigrated to the United States. All of this had nothing to do with me. What I read and wrote in the next 15 years didn't prepare me for my first visit to Cairo, Al-Qahira, translated as the victor. 15 million people at that time, and no traffic lights. The morning after my arrival, trying to ignore contemporary Cairo, as I had also tried to disregard contemporary Jerusalem and all the war and the strife that was going on, I walked from my hotel to the National Museum. As I entered, I felt that I could have been on Mars. Floor after floor with what I didn't know, never learned, and didn't understand. Glittering gold, black, and uncanny angles, minutely detailed drawings, symbols painted into an infinite perspective. Less than a week after I had seen those ants digging in the dust of Jericho, again, I felt totally disconnected and ephemeral compared with what I saw.